Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be going over the new Demon Hunter spec, Devourer. Now this is not a guide going over the best builds or how to pump out the most amount of damage, because on beta there's no damage meters right now. So I'm going to be explaining what the spec is, what the abilities do, the two hero talents, and some suggested builds on what is most likely going to happen. And of course, if you do enjoy the video, feel free to leave a like, leave down your feedback in the comment section below, and you might as well subscribe. It doesn't cost you a penny. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is this applies to all three Demon Hunter specs. In their class tree, there's a talent we call Wings of Wrath, which increases your glide speed by 40%, which honestly is insane. This may not look like a lot now because I'm high in the air, but like, let me show you when I get back on the ground. So if you play Demon Hunter, you know how fast the normal glide speed is, but look at this. Look at how much of a boost that 40% is. It's actually insane. Like, that in itself is just a forever movement ability that is on no cooldown. So that is something pretty huge that they added to Demon Hunters, which I think is cool. Okay, now to explain the basic fundamentals of Devourer Demon Hunter. It's really cool because similar to Evokers, they are a mid-range spec, which means they are casters. And your main filler ability is going to be Consume. It is on a 1.5 second cast that generates 8 Fury and generates a Soul Fragment. Now, of course, there are specific talents that will amplify your Consume, but Consume is going to be your general filler. Now, your next ability that is important is Reap. The Soul Fragments that Consume produces, you can either A, run through them, or by using Reap, it'll gather 4 of those nearby souls. Think of it like using Soul Cleave. And then Void Blade is just like your Fell Blade, except it's purple, which is cool. And then Void Ray is your eye beam. However, it's purple and voidy. Now here's the cool thing. In order to use Void Ray, it requires you to reach 100 Fury. Now Void Ray will either last 2.6 seconds or will drain you all the way down to 0 Fury. And these 4 buttons are your main primary rotation. So on a training dummy, it'll look something like this. So to start off, most likely I'll use Fell Blade or Void Blade. Now I have an ability called Hungering Slash, which after I use Void Blade or the Hunt, it'll turn into Hungering Slash, which is a big AoE that has a big scythe, and then it shatters soul fragments. So one thing that they're doing in Midnight is they are combining a lot of abilities together. So instead of having that ability, another button, it's just baked into these buttons. You literally have a 4-button rotation. I don't know of any other spec in the game that has a simpler rotation, especially in the most recent expansions. So I go in with Void Blade, Hungering Slash, and then I could use Vengeful Retreat. And now all I do is I press Consume. As you can see, these Void Orbs that are spawning around me after using it, I can consume by either A, running over them, or B, using Reap. And every time I consume one, it generates Fury. And also, this bar below your Fury bar is how many souls you've actually gathered. Upon reaching 50 souls, you can enter Void Metamorphosis. So now that I'm at 100 Fury, I can use Void Ray. It'll drain it. And then it also summons more fragments. I can consume them. So the entire point of the spec is to gather up as many souls as possible, because as you are about to see, now I have collected 50 souls so I can enter Void Metamorphosis. Now when I press this, it amplifies all my abilities similar to how it does in the other 2 specs, and I can press Void Ray without spending any Fury, and it's on a cooldown. So I'll show you. So I press Void Metamorphosis. Now I can press Void Ray. However, my Fury is constantly draining. Once my Fury hits 0, I then leave Metamorphosis. So your goal is to keep your Fury as high as possible the entire time, similar to how Shadow used to play in previous expansions. However, the longer you're in Metamorphosis, the faster your Fury will drain. Now, casting Void Ray in the Hunt during this will make it to where your Fury does not drain. Now, after consuming 30 souls, I can press Collapsing Star, which is your big AoE ability that hits for the most damage out of your entire spec. And then just like that, the rotation starts completely over again. Now to go over a few talents. If we take a look here in the class talent tree, they reworked a lot of the nodes. So from now on, you no longer have to spec into damage abilities down at the bottom, and they're more so for utility and defensive. Now, a few utility and CC things to keep in mind is you have Void Nova. Instead of, I think it was called Chaos Nova from the other 2 specs, it's now called Void Nova. Now there is why this one's different. It works the exact same way. However, you can use it from 30 yards away, whereas the other 2 specs have to use it in melee. So if I need to stun a pack, I can do it all the way from right here. And they're all stunned. Now on top of that, there's no longer Fell Eruption, but it's now baked into a passive. Your Void Nova will stun your primary target for an additional 2 seconds, so this might be useful in certain packs, depending on how long. So instead of a 2-second stun, it's a 4-second stun for your primary target. You are still able to spec into Imprison right here, and Sigil of Misery is now the first sigil that you can spec into in the top right. So those are really only your 3 CCs that you're able to use. Now for defensives, if you spec into Demonic Resilience, which is down here in the bottom right, Blur gains an additional charge. So Blur is realistically your only main defensive. And of course, down here in the middle, you can spec into Darkness. They simplified the class tree to where you can focus more on utility instead of focusing so much on having to spec into damage. Now, of course, there's still nodes that are for damage, but it's completely optional. Now, as we know, Havoc has Fell Rush and Vengeance has Infernal Strike. Devourer Demon Hunters have something called Shift. It's basically just a teleport. Really cool, very simple. Mind you, this is beta, so take everything you see in this video with a grain of salt, and these talents are changing basically every week. So that's why I'm not even trying to come up with the perfect talent build, and I'm really just trying to figure out what's fun and how different talent nodes interact with each other. Another cool thing to think about is Disrupt is now a 31-yard range interrupt. That is huge, and it's only on a 15-second cooldown. From what I can tell, it looks like you're gonna be running the hunt in every build. However, it is beta, so it can change at any moment. But in all the builds I've been trying to come up with, it seems like this will just do the most damage and makes the most sense. It also synergizes with the Void Scarred hero talent very well. On the topic of hero talents, we now have an entirely new hero talent, which is called Annihilator. Basically, what this means is when you use Consume, which is your filler ability, it has a 35% chance to grant you a stack of Voidfall. When you use the ability called Reap, which is the big scythe that consumes all of your Void fragments, it strikes down meteors at your target, which does AoE damage and just a lot of damage. This one's going to be your passive hero talent, which nothing's really going to change much in the rotation. So now if I swap over to my Void Scarred build, now Void Scarred works very similarly to how it did in Havoc and Vengeance in the War Within. Whenever you enter Metamorphosis, it empowers your abilities. However, on one of these talent nodes, it actually resets the hunt. Now once you hit 30 Void Fragments, you can use Collapsing Star, which is your biggest hitting ability. And your goal is to stay in Void Metamorphosis for as long as possible. And just like that, that is the primary rotation for Devourer Demon Hunters. Now I tried to see how many buttons you could really get with the spec, and it's not a lot. So as you can see on my bars, this is the most amount of buttons you can possibly get within the spec. The only thing that's been added is Consume Magic, Sigil of Misery, Imprison, Darkness, and Soul Immolation. Now in the spec talent tree, Soul Immolation is basically your immolation aura, but there's a passive right here, which makes it where it'll just naturally do it over time. And most likely, that's what you're probably going to be speccing into most. Overall, out of all specs in the game, this is the spec with the least amount of buttons. And I know they're pruning a lot of the specs in the game, but it's absolutely crazy the amount of buttons that it just doesn't have. But it works and it feels very fun. And I will definitely be playing Devour Demon Hunter in Midnight as my main alt because it's just too fun. Now to close out the video, if you want me to test out anything specifically on the beta or you have any technical questions about the spec, feel free to leave a comment down below and I will answer back as soon as possible. And I hope you enjoyed the video of me previewing the Devour Demon Hunter spec, and I appreciate you for being here. Y'all have a nice day, take care, and peace.